the orphan boy who dreamed of time. Sometimes, to understand the origin of an empire, one must go back so far that the shine and the prestige disappear from the landscape, until only the vulnerable figure of a child remains, trying to find his place in the world. Before Rolex became a global symbol of precision and status, before its name appeared in illuminated windows and on the wrists of those who shape culture and business, there was a young man named Hans Wilsdorf, a boy who experienced the fragility of life long before he understood its possibilities. His story does not begin with luxury, it begins with loss, and it is precisely that contrast that gives a special depth to everything he built afterward. Before continuing, I am very curious to know from which place in the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I will love reading you in the comments, and in that way feeling that this story travels with you while you settle down to listen to it calmly. Hans comes into the world in a family that, at least in appearance, had enough stability to offer him a peaceful childhood, but that feeling does not last long. When he is still very young, his parents pass away just a few months apart, leaving behind a void that cannot be filled with explanations or consolation. In a matter of weeks, the home disappears, the family direction becomes blurry, and everything a child considers eternal collapses as if it were made of sand. His uncles take responsibility for him and his siblings, although not with the intention of preserving the legacy of the parents, but with a more pragmatic attitude. They liquidate the family business, divide the assets, and look for a solution that allows them to move forward without carrying more concerns than necessary. For Hans, that episode is not only a change of residence, it is the first lesson, brutal and silent, that life can change without warning, and that even what seems solid can vanish without hesitation. His adolescence unfolds in a boarding school far from what he could have called home. There, where each day is marked by strict schedules and rigid rules, he discovers that time can be a structure that supports a kind of unexpected refuge. Where others feel oppression, he begins to find a form of comfort. A schedule does not abandon him, a bell does not betray him, a calendar does not fall apart from one day to the next. The hours become a sort of ally that allows him to understand the world in terms of order and constancy. That intimate relationship with time, born without him seeking it, will become the emotional root of the project he will develop decades later. While other young people dream of comfortable futures or inherited plans, Hans understands very early that he must carve his path with skill, discipline, and a special ability to observe the world. He takes advantage of every opportunity to learn languages, perfect writing, study commerce, and understand the logic that sustains international roots. He does not do it with the arrogance of someone who wants to appear more intelligent, but with the humility of someone who knows that the only real guarantee is the knowledge that is worked on day after day. When he finishes his formal education, life does not wait for him with a prepared position or a support network. Early loss has left him without those comforts, but it has also taught him a decisive lesson. If he does not build something of his own, he will always depend on the decisions of others. Thus, he begins to work in the world of commerce, a universe full of procedures, documents, deadlines, and goods that cross borders. It is there, among letters, orders, and products that must arrive on time, where his fascination for the instruments that allow all that movement to be coordinated is born. He understands that in a global market the most valuable thing is punctuality, and that whoever controls his time controls his destiny. In the midst of that dynamic environment, one object especially catches his attention: the watch. Not a decorative one, but a precise, resistant, and reliable one. An instrument capable of keeping rhythm even when the outside world becomes unpredictable. Hans is not yet a technician nor an inventor. He does not design gears nor calibers, but his intuition is sharp, and he recognizes that the value of a watch capable of guaranteeing accuracy is not only practical, but psychological. It represents something he always desired: stability in a changing world. That fascination does not arise as a superficial ambition, but as a kind of internal conversation with his own story. Someone who lost so much so early needs to believe that it is possible to create something that remains, something that does not depend on the decisions of others, something small but capable of symbolizing order in the chaos. The idea does not yet have the form of a company nor a business project, but it is alive inside him, growing slowly while he learns about markets, clients, suppliers, and commercial routes. Hans absorbs all that knowledge without haste but without rest. He observes how the international economy works, how each decision depends on minutes, how a delay can change the fate of an entire business. That global vision, together with his sensitivity to time, begins to draw an intuition that will accompany him forever. In the future, society will need more precise, more practical, more reliable watches. Watches that are not a passing accessory, but an indispensable tool. With the years, his character becomes stronger. The discipline he learned in the boarding school blends with the determination of someone who knows the fragility of life, and that combination creates a different type of entrepreneur. He does not move by impulses, but by deep convictions. He does not seek immediate recognition, but to build a solid foundation upon which he can raise something that lasts. And while he works in offices where international trade breathes through each letter sent and each contract signed, he begins to feel that watchmaking could become the place where he unites his personal story with a real need of the modern world. Nothing seems to foretell yet the magnitude of what is to come, but his path begins to take shape, just like a mechanism that is being assembled piece by piece until, without anyone noticing, it begins to beat for the first time. And with that silent impulse that drives those who feel that their destiny is beyond what life has given them at the beginning, Hans makes a decision that will change his trajectory forever. To leave his country and head toward a city that at that time was synonymous with commerce, industry, and new opportunities, the place where his intuition will begin to take real shape. London, suitcases, and a mechanical dream. When Hans Wilsdorf heads to London at the beginning of the 20th century, he does not travel as an heir, going to supervise a fortune, nor as a dandy seeking social life in a great capital. He travels as a young man who carries in his suitcase something much more discreet and much more powerful than money. A mixture of discipline, hunger for opportunity, and an almost obsessive sensitivity for time that he has been refining since adolescence. The city that receives him has nothing friendly in terms of landscape. It is an industrial London, covered in smoke, factories, crowded stations, and a humidity that seems to seep into everything, even into one's mood. But for someone with his mentality, that density of activity becomes an ideal stage, because in every street one feels that something is being bought, something is being sold, and something is being set in motion. London, in those years, functions as a kind of center of gravity for international trade. Ships enter and leave the port with a constant rhythm, loaded with raw materials, manufactured products and goods of all kinds, headed to the most remote corners of the world. In commercial offices, letters, contracts, and purchase orders pile up, and each document carries with it dates, deadlines, and hours that must be respected to the very millimeter. Hans integrates himself into that environment as an employee, not in glamorous positions, but in the gears that make things truly work. He works surrounded by people who understand that a delay of one day can ruin an operation, that a late delivery can break the trust of a client on another continent, and that punctuality is not simply arriving on time, but honoring one's word. In the middle of that ecosystem, the young Wilsdorf begins to pay special attention to a sector that, to the eyes of many, is nothing more than a niche within the world of luxury: watchmaking. From London, he has access to suppliers, importers, and jewelry shops, and he discovers that behind every watch sold as an elegant object lie complex production and distribution chains, in which Switzerland occupies a central place thanks to its precision and tradition. He realizes that the best mechanical movements do not originate on the British island, but in Swiss workshops where artisans and small manufacturers have achieved extraordinary mastery of the craft. At the same time, he observes that the British market has prestigious jewelry shops, demanding clients, and a level of purchasing power capable of paying for quality pieces. In other words, he sees two worlds that could fit together perfectly if someone were willing to interconnect them in a more intelligent way. In that context, a key figure appears in the story: Alfred Davis, Hans's brother-in-law, and a man with whom he shares entrepreneurial concerns and a similar vision about the potential of the market. Together, they begin to talk about the idea of establishing their own company, a business dedicated to importing Swiss movements to house them in watch cases manufactured in England, thus combining Swiss technical excellence with British reputation in metals and finishes. The idea, explained coldly, might seem like a simple logical move within the commerce of the time, but for Wilsdorf it is the first real step towards something he had been imagining for years, building a structure that depends on his decisions, his criteria, his way of understanding quality and reliability. Thus, in the year 1905, Wilsdorf and Davis is born, a small company occupying a modest space on the map of London, but representing a gigantic leap in Hans's life. He ceases to be merely an employee and becomes someone who assumes the risk and responsibility of each order, each client, and each invoice. They handle the distribution of watches to jewelry shops that, in many cases, sell the pieces under their own name, as was customary at the time. That detail, which might seem like a simple formality, begins to trouble Hans, because he understands that, if he wants to build something lasting, it is not enough to be just another shadowy supplier. His long-term vision clashes with the idea of invisibility. While managing orders and earning a reputation among merchants, Wilsdorf pays attention to another cultural battle that is being waged almost without anyone announcing it: the struggle between the traditional pocket watch and the wristwatch. At the beginning of the 20th century, many men consider the wristwatch a fragile accessory, almost decorative, more acceptable for women than for gentlemen. The serious watch, the one respected in masculine circles, remains the pocket watch, kept in a well-pressed waistcoat and attached to a chain. For a conformist spirit, the logical thing would have been to follow what the market demanded and limit himself to offering what was already established. But Wilsdorf detects something different. He sees that the world is speeding up, that modern life demands more practical solutions, and that the idea of having time accessible on the wrist, visible at all moments, fits this new dynamic. He then begins to bet on wristwatches with high-quality Swiss movements, smaller watches, more comfortable, designed to be used in daily life. He faces the skepticism of jewelers and clients who see that bet as a passing fashion, but he insists on improving precision, on caring for design, on offering something that feels professional, not a toy. He is aware that the great challenge is to change people's perception of that object, and he knows that the only way to do so is by ensuring that it functions impeccably and withstands real use outside the shop windows. Inside the offices of Wilsdorf and Davis, the atmosphere is that of a young company living day by day, attentive to each shipment, each satisfied client, each payment received. There are no great luxuries, but there is a sense of purpose that permeates the way they work. Hans reviews, catalogs, compares suppliers, adjusts specifications, and at the same time watches carefully how buyers react to each new model that reaches the market. That combination of obsession with detail and ability to listen to the client becomes one of his great strengths. Little by little, his own personality merges with the budding culture of the company, demanding quality, a taste for precision, and an international mentality that allows him to think beyond the borders of the United Kingdom or Germany. He masters several languages, understands cultural differences between markets, and knows that the perfect watch for a British merchant may not be the same one that fascinates a client in another country. That sensitivity prepares him for something still yet to come: the creation of a brand identity capable of transcending borders and being pronounced with the same ease in London, in Paris, in New York, or in any other place where time has value. Meanwhile, the young entrepreneur lives each day with a small internal conflict. His company moves, watches, yes, but the name appearing on the dials is usually that of the jewelry shop that sells them, not that of the person who has managed the chain that makes them possible. It is as if his work remained hidden behind someone else's curtains. That feeling of anonymity is uncomfortable for someone with such a clear vision of what quality means, and it makes him reflect on the importance of building something recognizable, a name that, when it appears on the dial of a watch, is understood as a concrete promise of precision and prestige. Thus, amid the smoke of trains, the noise of markets, and the eternal London rains, an idea begins to take shape in the mind of Hans Wilsdorf, one that goes beyond importing and assembling mechanisms. He begins to understand that the next logical step in his path is not only to improve the watches he offers, but to give them a name of their own, a brief and forceful identity capable of staying in the memory of anyone who sees it engraved on a tiny dial. And it will be precisely that silent search for a name worthy of his ambitions that will mark the beginning of a new chapter in his story. The name is born, 5 immortal letters. In the early years of Wilsdorf and Davis, the cases arrived. The Swiss movements were assembled with patience. The watches were distributed to prestigious jewelry shops. And the customers, satisfied, returned to buy again. But there was a detail that for many went unnoticed, and that for Hans had become a small thorn stuck in his mind. On the dial, what the buyer saw engraved was not his work, nor his criteria, nor his demands, but the name of the jewelry shop that made the final sale. In the eyes of the world, the watch belonged to the jeweler. The manufacturer remained hidden behind the scenes, and that clashed head-on with the long-term vision he was beginning to develop. That idea that the true strength, in a market that would become increasingly global, would reside in the brand and in the direct trust that the public placed in it. Hans was clear that the time had come to take a decisive step in building identity, a step that implied ceasing to be an intermediary who provided impeccable mechanisms to others, and beginning to assume the risk of signing with a personal name each piece that emerged from his orbit. However, that move could not be made in just any way. It was not enough to stamp Wilsdorf and Davis on a tiny dial, because it was too long, too difficult to place visually in a harmonious design, and too complex for many international clients to pronounce. What he needed was a brief and forceful term, one capable of being pronounced naturally in different languages and sufficiently resonant to remain fixed in the memory of anyone who heard it once. A stage of patient, almost obsessive searching then began, in which Hans filled papers with combinations of letters, wrote down words, pronounced them softly, imagined them printed on the dial of a watch, mentally playing with the typography, with the visual balance they would have on the enameled background. He was not improvising. He was designing a symbol. He knew that the name would be the visible signature of everything he believed a watch should represent: precision, reliability, understated elegance, and a personality recognizable among many others. For days, even weeks, there appeared a succession of attempts that did not quite convince him. Names that were too long, too complicated, too tied to a region or a particular language. Terms that might sound good in German but lost strength when pronounced in English, or vice versa. In that refinement process, there is something very interesting from an entrepreneurial perspective. Hans did not settle for the first acceptable option. He did not let himself be carried away by haste, and even when the business was advancing and it would have been tempting to continue invoicing without stopping at details, he took the time to think about the future, about the imprint he wanted to leave. Every day he devoted to that search seemed, from the outside, unproductive, but in reality he was defining the core of what would become one of the most influential brands of the century. That patience, that willingness not to rush a decision that would mark the company for decades, is what differentiates the occasional merchant from the builder of a legacy. At some point in this process, whether in a carriage, in his office, or walking through the city, a word finally appeared that felt different from the rest. There are various romantic versions about the exact origin. Some speak of an inner whisper during a journey in a horse-drawn carriage. others of an inspiration while writing possible names. What matters is that when that specific sequence of letters surfaced, something in his mind aligned. It was short. It sounded resounding. It was easy to pronounce both in English and in German, or in French. It fit without difficulty on the watch dial, without saturating it, and at the same time possessed a musicality that made it memorable. From that moment on, he began repeating the word mentally, writing it, looking at it from different angles, and each repetition reinforced the feeling that he had found what he had been searching for. In 1908, Hans officially registered that name as a brand. That administrative act, which could seem like just another bureaucratic procedure, actually represented a strategic turning point. From that moment on, the company was no longer simply sending watches out into the world. It was sending a compact message engraved on each dial, a message that said, in essence, "Way." This watch responds to a specific standard, to a vision of watchmaking, to a promise of quality. The name would cease to be an internal detail and would become the element that united the perception of thousands of clients dispersed across various countries, with different cultures and languages, who would gradually associate that word with positive experiences. The impact of that decision was not perceived immediately as an explosion, but as a constant current. At first, some jewelers were reluctant to give up the habit of placing their own name on the dial, since that gave them the sense of controlling the relationship with the customer, of being the ones who capitalized on the prestige of the piece. However, Wilsdorf insisted, negotiated, explained, argued that a name specialized in watchmaking could help sell better, could transmit more trust than a signature perhaps associated with multiple products. Gradually, he gained ground, and the brand began to appear in shop windows, catalogs, and advertisements, always associated with the idea of precision and reliability. Behind that insistence was a very clear understanding of the power of the symbol. For Hans, the name was not a decorative label placed at the end of the manufacturing process. It was an essential part of the product. Without that recognizable signature, each watch would be an isolated object. With it, they all became pieces of the same story, chapters of a business, narrative that grew year after year. This is a powerful lesson for any entrepreneur. When you build a real brand, what you sell ceases to be an individual product and becomes a concrete manifestation of a shared promise. Each unit sold reinforces or weakens that promise, and that is why he was so demanding with the quality of everything that carried the new name on the dial. From that moment on, the company began to think of itself differently. It was no longer simply Wilsdorf and Davis moving merchandise between Switzerland and the United Kingdom. It was an entity with an identity condensed into a short term, an identity that traveled in press advertisements, in catalogs, in the words of the clients themselves. The wristwatch, still in the process of earning respect among the male public, found in that signature a kind of shield. If it bore that name, it conveyed that it was not a fragile whim, but a piece built with seriousness. The brand acted as a bridge between Swiss tradition and British modernity, uniting artisanal craftsmanship and commercial ambition in a single concept. With that foundation, Hans began to think through each decision from a different logic. The design of the dials, the shape of the cases, the precision of the movements, the communication, everything was oriented toward reinforcing a coherent image, toward making each watch that reached the market tell, without words, the same story. If you trust this name, you can trust the time it marks, the resistance it offers, and the durability it promises. This approach would become a kind of internal compass that would guide decades of decisions, even when new generations took over. While London remained shrouded in industrial smoke and the world approached, unknowingly, a period of great political and economic upheavals, Hans Wilsdorf had already taken the step that transformed his project into something much greater than an import company. He now had an emblem to protect, a word to defend with actions and with impeccable products. And that newly born brand would soon have to face a harsh context, marked by wars, rising taxes, and shifting landscapes that would force even riskier decisions to secure its future. War, taxes, and the leap to Switzerland. When the name of the brand begins to appear on the dials and to be spoken with a certain familiarity in the world of watchmaking, the international landscape takes an abrupt turn that no entrepreneur would have wished for, but that many are forced to face. The years of the First World War are approaching, and with them come uncertainty, economic instability, and a climate in which luxury falls under suspicion. London, which until then had been for Hans Wilsdorf the perfect center from which to grow his dream, slowly becomes a tenser and more closely watched place where political decisions weigh more and more on business. As the conflict advances, trade suffers everywhere. The ships that once came and went loaded with goods find mined seas, blockades, and controls. Insurance becomes more expensive, delivery times grow longer, and customs become more rigorous. For a company like his, which depends on Swiss movements that must cross borders and on clients spread across different countries, each new obstacle becomes a potential threat. In addition, the wristwatch begins to be adopted by the military, who need to have the time in view without losing precious seconds taking a watch out of a pocket in the middle of action, which confirms an intuition that Hans had defended for years. But this advance arrives in a strained context in which growing becomes more complex each day. When the war ends, peace does not automatically bring calm to the business environment. Governments, indebted and with resentful societies, begin to seek sources of income and to control more harshly sectors considered non-essential, among them luxury. In the United Kingdom, high taxes are imposed on imported products and on high-price items, which directly affects companies that work with quality watches coming from Switzerland. Suddenly, each piece that enters the country pays a toll that punishes profit margins, raises the price of the final product, and forces a strategic rethinking. Hans observes with attention how the rules of the game change. The watches he wants to sell are not trinkets. They are designed to last, to offer precision, to represent something more than a passing whim, and yet they become trapped in the category of luxury items on which special taxes fall. In addition, the relationship with Swiss suppliers becomes conditioned by these changes. Logistics becomes more complicated, and the dream of building a global brand begins to collide with an environment that places more and more walls in front of him. For someone with a complacent mindset, these factors would be excuses to slow down, to settle for maintaining what already exists. But in the mind of Wilsdorf, another line of thought emerges. If the terrain becomes too hostile, perhaps the winning move is to change the terrain entirely. There is another element that influences this reflection: the technical heart of the brand's watches beats in Switzerland. The precision, movements, the mechanical innovations, and the deepest watchmaking culture are not in London. They are in Swiss cities, where artisans and manufacturers have achieved a level of mastery recognized throughout the world. For years, the combination of Swiss production and British commercial platform worked well, but the context after the war breaks that balance. Geneva, with its watchmaking tradition and its position in a neutral country, begins to appear in Hans's mind not only as a source of components, but as a possible definitive home for his company. The decision to move the epicenter of a business is never light. London had given him opportunities, had allowed him to found his first company, register his brand, find partners, clients, and an important distribution network. There he had consolidated himself as an entrepreneur and had watched his vision take form. However, loyalty to a city cannot be placed above loyalty to the project. Wilsdorf understands that his mission is to protect the future of the brand, not to cling to a geography out of sentimentality. As he reviews numbers, analyzes taxes, evaluates risks, and speaks with his Swiss contacts, he begins to see clearly that if he wants the company to breathe freely, he must bring it closer to the place where the movements that make it possible are born. Thus arrives the year 1919, a key date in the history of the company. After many arrangements, Hans makes the decision that will redefine the map of his business, moving the headquarters to Geneva. The Swiss city, surrounded by mountains and with a long tradition of precision, becomes the new nerve center of the company. There, Montres Rolex Sociedad Anónima will be established, the entity that will give continuity and depth to the work begun in London, but now with conditions more favorable to the development of watchmaking as he imagines it. The move is risky because it implies redoing part of the structure, adapting to a new legal, cultural, and commercial environment, and rebuilding distribution networks from a different base. However, it also brings significant advantages. Being closer to Swiss workshops and manufacturers allows more direct quality control, encourages joint innovation, and strengthens the Swiss seal in the identity of the brand. In addition, the position of Switzerland, relatively stable in political and economic terms, offers a refuge in the face of the fluctuations of the great powers that are going through a period of recomposition after the war. From the perspective of someone who listens to this story while thinking about their own projects, the message is very powerful. There are moments in which the key to growth is not to keep pushing within the same frame, but to dare to change the frame entirely. Hans could have stayed in London lamenting the taxes, criticizing government decisions and blaming the environment for the difficulties, but he preferred to ask himself an uncomfortable question. Where can the vision of the company develop better in the next 20 or 30 years? The answer was not in nostalgia, but in a cold analysis of resources, restrictions, and opportunities. Once settled in Geneva, the company's focus becomes even sharper. The bond with Swiss watchmaking ceases to be a relationship of supplier and client and becomes a strategic union. The brand associates itself with the image of Helvetic precision, which strengthens its positioning before a public that understands that if someone wants a serious mechanical watch, looking towards Switzerland is always a good idea. At the same time, from that new center, Hans can better coordinate efforts to achieve precision certifications, establish demanding internal standards, and work more closely with those who develop movements, cases, and components. The move does not mean breaking with the British past, because the experience accumulated in London, the relationships with jewelry stores, and the understanding of the Anglo-Saxon market continue to be important assets. The great difference is that now the company operates with a base more suitable to its deepest needs. It is as if, after years of building a structure on good ground, someone offered him an even more solid soil from which to raise a taller and more ambitious building. And Wilsdorf does not hesitate to accept that opportunity, even if it means assuming once again the vertigo of beginning anew in certain aspects. With time, the decision proves to be correct. From Geneva, the brand has space to perfect its proposal, think long-term, and prepare for a new type of challenge, one that will no longer be only fiscal or geopolitical, but technical. Once the place from which to operate is secured, Hans can concentrate his energy on another problem that had been circling his mind for a long time: the vulnerability of wristwatches to water, dust, and the aggressions of daily life. And it will be precisely from that new Swiss base that he will launch one of the most iconic innovations in the entire history of modern watchmaking. The Oyster, overcoming water and doubt. In the new stage from Geneva, with the company already established in an environment more favorable to watchmaking precision, Hans Wilsdorf finds himself facing a paradox that irritates him every day. The wristwatch begins to gain ground in daily life, but it remains a delicate object, excessively vulnerable to something as simple as a few drops of water or some particles of dust that slip into the movement and ruin everything. He wants his brand to represent reliability in any reasonable circumstance of everyday life, without the user having to behave as if carrying on the wrist a piece of crystal that must be protected at every step, and that distance between ideal and reality is unacceptable to him. The typical scene is very clear. A customer satisfied with the precision of the watch, with its appearance, with the comfort of the wrist format, begins to use it with confidence, until one day he is caught in the rain, or washes his hands with some carelessness, or ventures into a slightly more demanding activity. Suddenly, the mechanism begins to fail. The hand stops. The watch fogs up inside, and all the prestige of the piece collapses in an instant. For someone obsessed with time like Wilsdorf, who sees precision as a kind of moral contract between the brand and the user, these types of failures are not isolated incidents. They are a clear sign that a key piece is missing in the design. Instead of resigning himself to the technical limit of his era, he decides to confront the root of the problem, the case. Until then, many wristwatches were, in essence, small adapted pocket watches with snap closures, exposed crowns, and a very poor level of sealing. If the movement was well adjusted, it worked as long as it remained in a gentle environment. As soon as real life intervened with sweat, humidity, or dust, breakdowns appeared. Hans understands that if he wants to sell the idea of a truly modern daily use instrument, he must turn the case into a kind of shield that protects the movement with almost absolute effectiveness. He begins to study technical solutions, analyzes patents, talks with specialized manufacturers, and examines designs that attempt to improve protection of the movement. The goal is not a small incremental advance, it is a conceptual leap, moving from a watch tolerant of humidity to a watch designed to ignore it completely within reasonable margins. From that search emerges the idea of a completely sealed case, with back and bezel screwed down and, above all, with a screwed-in crown that closes the most delicate point of the structure, the place where the watch is wound and the time is adjusted. The result of that work is presented in the year 1926 under a name that contains a very simple and at the same time very powerful metaphor: Oyster. Just as the shell of an oyster protects what is inside with an unexpected strength for such a small body, the new case protects the movement of the watch, sealing it against the invisible enemies that previously slipped in without difficulty. The design combines gaskets, threads, and carefully fitted surfaces so that water and dust remain outside, with no chance of getting in. It is not just a commercial trick, it is engineering applied with a clear intention to transform the relationship between the user and the watch. From that moment on, whoever wears one of these watches no longer has to monitor every gesture for fear that a few drops will ruin the mechanism. He can wash his hands, be caught in a downpour, live a minimally active life without feeling that he carries on his wrist a fragile object. That feeling of security changes the user experience, and with it the meaning of the product changes. The watch approaches the concept of a precision tool rather than that of a delicate jewel, and that transformation fits perfectly with the vision that Wilsdorf had been maturing since his years in international trade. Time is a serious resource, and whoever manages it well needs instruments up to the task. However, Hans knows that the battle is not won only on the technical level. He may create the best sealing system on the market, but if the public does not understand it, if distributors are not able to convey it, if people do not come to believe that the watch truly resists water, the impact will be very limited. Here his strategist side reappears, that ability to turn a technical feature into a story that anyone can visualize and remember. To demonstrate that his invention is not an empty claim, he needs a spectacular proof, something the press can report, and that is as graphic as a photograph. The opportunity comes with a young British swimmer, Mercedes Gleitze, who in the year 1927 sets out to swim across the English Channel, a very hard feat. In cold waters and during endless hours, Wilsdorf understands that this extreme test can become the perfect stage to demonstrate the reliability of the Oyster. He manages to have her wear one of his watches hanging from her neck during the attempt, exposed to salt water, constant movement, and the most hostile conditions a wristwatch could face in that era. When the attempt ends, the watch continues to function with precision, with no traces of water inside, without fogging, fulfilling its function as if it had been in a much gentler environment. This episode gives him the material he needed for a different communication campaign. He publishes newspaper advertisements recounting the swimmer's feat and the resistance of the watch, and takes the demonstration even further with a gesture of brilliant simplicity. In the windows of certain jewelry shops, he places the Oyster inside small fish tanks, completely submerged, while they continue to mark the time underwater. Anyone who walks past those windows sees, literally, a watch functioning in an environment that previously would have been its death sentence. The idea remains etched in the public mind with a clarity that no technical text could have achieved. From the business perspective, this set of decisions illustrates very well the union between innovation and narrative. The sealed case is the result of analysis and technical work. The collaboration with a swimmer and the fish tanks in shop windows are the result of psychological understanding, of knowing how people trust what they cannot see directly. Wilsdorf does not limit himself to stating that his watch is water-resistant. He creates situations in which that resistance becomes visible, almost theatrical, leaving no room for doubt. That way of communicating turns the Oyster into something more than a mechanical advance. It becomes a symbol of reliability in a world that was becoming increasingly dynamic and demanding. For an entrepreneur, there are several overlapping lessons here. On the one hand, the importance of confronting the weaknesses of your product with honesty and turning them into challenges to be solved, rather than hiding them behind excuses. On the other hand, the value of protecting a brand promise not only with words but with forceful actions that the customer can understand, remember, and tell others. And, additionally, the idea that the real context of use must always guide innovation. Wristwatches were destined to accompany people in motion, not to live locked in display cabinets. With the Oyster, Rolex consolidates a pillar of its technical identity, sealing. From then on, this characteristic becomes an inseparable part of the brand's image, which can no longer be understood without that robust, screwed-down case designed to endure. However, in the restless mind of Hans Wilsdorf, the work is not finished. He has protected the body of the watch, has armored its skin against the elements, but another question begins to take shape in his nights of reflection. If the exterior has reached that level of perfection, perhaps the time has come to revolutionize also the way the interior beats, the way the watch receives the energy that keeps it alive, without depending so much on the user's memory to wind it every day. Perpetual, the watch that charges itself. After the technical and symbolic success of the Oyster, Rolex had managed to solve a fundamental problem in wristwatch making: the vulnerability of the exterior. However, inside the hermetic case, there still beat a mechanism that depended on a daily and almost ritual gesture from the user, a gesture that for many was part of its charm, but that for Hans Wilsdorf represented a hidden vulnerability. Winding the watch every day was, in theory, a simple task, although in practice it became a constant source of potential failures. It was enough to forget it for 24 hours for the watch to stop. It was enough for the crown to be handled carelessly for moisture to enter if it was not properly closed. It was enough for the watch to be used too aggressively for the spring to suffer excessive tension. All of this worried Hans, who had long imagined a watch capable of functioning with the same constancy as the human body itself. In those years, Swiss watchmaking was experiencing a period of intense creativity. Different watchmakers experimented with automatic mechanisms, systems that allowed the natural movement of the wrist to wind the mainspring without the user needing to intervene consciously. However, many of those experiments suffered from reliability problems, rotors that were too large or too small, friction issues that were poorly resolved, reversible mechanisms that wore out, unnecessary complications that reduced stability. There were inventors with interesting ideas, but someone was needed who was willing to turn those scattered attempts into a robust system capable of functioning for years without significant failures. Wilsdorf approached the challenge with his usual blend of ambition and pragmatism. It was not enough for him to have a mechanism that worked in laboratory conditions. He wanted one that would survive the real life of a user who walks, works, travels, and moves with energy or clumsiness. For him, the automatic watch had to become the next natural step within the revolution initiated by the Oyster. A watch that protected the movement and that also kept that movement active without the need for daily reminders. The idea was simple to express, but enormously complex to execute, because it implied modifying the very heart of the watch. After years of work and analysis of various solutions, in the year 1931, Rolex officially introduced its unidirectional rotor system, called Perpetual. This mechanism was based on a metallic semicircle that could rotate freely in only one direction, harnessing the natural movements of the user's arm to tension the mainspring. The great innovation lay in the combination of an efficient design and a surprising mechanical simplicity that reduced to a minimum the parts susceptible to failure and increased the durability of the whole. It was an elegant, compact, and extraordinarily practical solution that made a clear difference compared to previous attempts. The Perpetual was not simply a technical addition. It changed the experience of the wristwatch. From that moment on, those who wore a Rolex no longer needed to worry about winding it daily. The watch remained alive as they moved, and that detail created an almost symbiotic feeling between the object and its wearer. The watch stopped being an instrument that demanded constant attention and transformed into a companion that responded to the natural rhythm of life. That change, seemingly modest, deeply altered the way people perceived the practical value of the mechanical watch. In the industry, the advancement had a considerable impact. Many watchmakers understood that this was the path to follow if they wanted to remain relevant in a world that was modernizing at great speed. The watch could no longer be something that required constant care. It had to integrate itself into daily routines without asking for anything in return. By adopting this concept and perfecting it with its own standards, Rolex placed itself in a position of technological leadership that reinforced the image Wilsdorf had been building for years. That of a brand obsessed with offering real, useful, and resistant precision in everyday life. For Hans, however, the importance of the Perpetual went beyond the mechanical. When he spoke about this system, he always referred to the idea that a watch should be an extension of the person who wears it, an object that adapts to their movement, to their activity, to their changes in rhythm. This emphasis on the relationship between user and product reveals a very modern, almost emotional approach to watchmaking. Wilsdorf understood that if he wanted his brand to transcend the basic function of measuring time, he had to make his watches feel alive, connected in some way to the energy of the person who used them. From a narrative perspective, it is also fascinating to observe how the Perpetual completes a logical cycle within the path that had begun years earlier. First, he had protected the exterior with the Oyster, creating a case capable of defending the watch from the environment. Then he had strengthened the interior with a mechanism that feeds itself thanks to the human movement. It was as if the brand had shaped an organism that breathes through the body, that wears it, that keeps functioning without the need for conscious intervention, and that, moreover, remains safe inside a resistant structure. This combination, expressed with impressive clarity in the watches of those years, turned Rolex into something more than a manufacturer of precision. It transformed it into a creator of modern watches in the fullest sense of the word. Recognition for the Perpetual system came from different fronts: customers, watchmakers, critics, even official certification institutions. The reliability demonstrated by the watches equipped with this mechanism reinforced trust in the brand and opened the doors to new market segments that sought durable instruments for demanding professions. The union between hermeticity and automatic mechanism became a distinctive seal that, with the passage of the years, would end up defining the technical identity of the company. For any entrepreneur who hears this story from a distance, there is a message that deserves to be highlighted. Great innovations often arise from a combination of obsession with details, deep understanding of the user, and courage to rethink something that seemed untouchable. Winding a watch was a habit accepted by everyone, almost a social ritual. But Wilsdorf did not settle for that habit. He asked himself if it was truly necessary, if it was logical, if it was coherent with modern life. Questioning what is taken for granted, even when it seems like an established tradition, is a powerful tool for finding solutions that change entire industries. By the end of the decade of the 1930s, Rolex had already established the technical foundations that would characterize many of its models for generations: hermeticity, certified precision, and energy autonomy. These three ideas became solid pillars, upon which the watches that would accompany explorers, athletes, aviators, and professionals of all kinds in the following decades were built. The work of Hans Wilsdorf had shaped a technical identity that still sustains the brand's reputation today. And while the Perpetual was proving in the market its ability to change the daily life of those who wore it, the world was once again approaching a dark period. The growing instability in Europe was beginning to tint the horizon with a troubling tone, and that atmosphere marked by tension would end up testing not only the reliability of the watches, but also the personal values of Wilsdorf himself, who would face circumstances that would reveal a more human and lesser-known facet of his character. Rolex at war, pilots, prisoners of war, and hope. When the world once again turns gray and the wounds of a global war reopen, precision watches stop being simple instruments of daily life and become, in many cases, tools of survival. During the Second World War, time is measured with a different intensity. Minutes that determine the success of an air mission, seconds that separate life from death in a bombing, days that feel eternal inside a prisoner camp. In that brutal context, the work that Hans Wilsdorf had developed for decades, that obsession with accuracy, with resistance, and with true reliability, finds an unexpected stage in which to prove its value, not in luxurious display windows, but on the wrists of people who risk their lives. Among those who begin to appreciate in a special way the advantages of a good wristwatch are many pilots of the Royal Air Force of Great Britain. These men, responsible for flying in extreme conditions, for navigating skies covered in clouds, smoke, and fire, needed instruments that would not fail in mid-flight. The official watches they received as equipment often fell short of expectations, so some of them began to look for alternatives in the civilian market. There they discovered that the watches of a certain Swiss brand resisted pressure changes well, endured vibrations, kept time with precision, and offered clear legibility in moments of tension. Without knowing it, they became improvised ambassadors of that brand that Hans had named years earlier with such care. On the air bases, the watch becomes almost part of the uniform. Some pilots pay out of their own pocket for a better piece, aware that the instrument on their wrist can help them calculate flight times, remaining fuel, and critical coordinates. When they take off on missions over enemy territory, they carry with them something more than metal and gears. They carry the feeling that, at least in that specific aspect, they can trust what they have. That trust, in an environment where so many things slip out of their control, becomes a very powerful psychological resource. But war is not a film of invincible heroes, and many of those pilots end up shot down, captured, and sent to prisoner camps. Upon arriving there, expensive watches, jewelry, and any object of value pass into the hands of those who run the camp. In many cases, the soldiers watch as their watch is taken from them as if it were a relic of the world they left behind. On their wrist remains the emptiness, not only of the object itself, but of what it represented: precision, routine, a piece of normality in the midst of chaos. It is in this dark scenario that Hans Wilsdorf makes a decision that speaks as much of his vision of the brand as of his personal sense of human dignity. From Geneva, he receives news that numerous British officers, former clients of the brand, are being stripped of their watches upon being captured. He could limit himself to seeing it as inevitable collateral damage, but instead he asks himself what he can do, from his position, to change at least a fragment of that reality. The answer he finds is as simple in appearance as it is profound in its implications: to offer those prisoners the possibility of receiving a new watch sent to the camps without demanding payment in advance. The mechanism is almost unbelievable for the time. The prisoner writes a letter to the company in Switzerland, explains his situation, indicates the model he had or that he desires, provides the necessary identification data, and from the headquarters of the brand, a replacement watch is sent to him, assuming that when the war ends and he regains his freedom, he will pay the debt. It is a gigantic bet on the word of men who, at that moment, have nothing more to offer than their name and their future promise. For many business minds, this would be madness. For Hans, It is a declaration of trust in the individual, backed by his own biography as an orphan child who had to build his life from the void. To imagine the scene of a prisoner receiving a package from Switzerland, opening it in a cold barrack and finding a new, fully functional watch, is to understand why this gesture remained engraved in the memory of so many. In an environment where time seems to have stopped, where each day blends with the next, being able to look at a clean dial, watch the hands move, and recover the ability to measure the hours with precision becomes almost an act of intimate resistance. That watch is not just a useful object. It is a reminder that outside the barbed wire, a world still exists where someone trusts that you will return, that you will be able to rebuild your life, pay your debts, and reconstruct your destiny. From the point of view of brand building, this episode is a masterstroke, although surely Hans did not conceive it with commercial cynicism, but with a mixture of humanity and long-term vision. It is impossible to quantify how many of those men, once freed, became passionate defenders of the brand, but it is easy to sense it. One thing is to be satisfied with a product. A very different one is to feel that, in the darkest moment, that company stood by your side, without knowing your face, without having guarantees of economic return. That difference translates into loyalty, into pride, into stories told again and again to children, friends, and colleagues for decades. Furthermore, this human bond opens doors to strategic markets such as Great Britain and the United States, where the image of the brand becomes associated not only with precision and luxury, but also with values of trust, seriousness, and commitment. Through a gesture that could be considered almost reckless from a short-term accounting perspective, Rolex sows a reputation that no conventional advertisement could have bought. The brand becomes part of personal stories deeply charged with emotion, and that type of presence is the dream of any legacy builder. For anyone thinking of becoming an entrepreneur or already managing a personal project, there is here a lesson of enormous weight. The true value of a company is not measured solely in the balance sheets of each year. It is also measured in the decisions it makes when no one forces it, in how it behaves when no one guarantees immediate return. In a world where many businesses move only by cold calculations, a genuinely risky action, guided by principles, can become the cornerstone of an unbreakable reputation. As the war advances and the continent bleeds, Rolex continues operating from Switzerland with all the difficulties inherent to a global conflict, but with a clear internal compass to maintain quality, sustain trust, and respond consistently to the ideal that its founder has been consolidating since youth. When at last the weapons fall silent and Europe begins the long and painful process of reconstruction, the brand finds itself in a privileged position, not only because of its technical achievements, but because of the enormous reserve of goodwill accumulated among thousands of people who associate it with dignity and hope. In that moment of transition, with the recent past marked by devastation and the future still unwritten, Hans Wilsdorf begins to look beyond his own life and wonders what will become of the company when he is no longer here. How to ensure that the project he built from nothing maintains its foundational principles, even in the hands of those who have not yet been born, and in what way he can arrange his legacy so that the company remains strong, independent, and faithful to its identity for generations. Foundation, legacy, and the birth of Tudor. When Europe begins to recover a certain stability after the disaster of the war, Hans Wilsdorf goes through a period of deep reflection. He has more than 40 years building a brand that was born from a youthful intuition, grew through sheer obstinacy, and ended up becoming a global reference of precision and reliability. However, with each passing year, he becomes more aware of something that, sooner or later, reaches all visionary founders. The idea that the work may survive the man, but only if brave decisions are made before time renders them impossible. The watchmaker who had dedicated his life to taming time begins to confront the only question before which no engineering can offer absolute guarantees. What will happen to the company when he is no longer there to guide it? Wilsdorf was not an entrepreneur who lived for applause, nor someone who sought to monumentalize his name on a plaque. He was, above all, a man who had experienced the fragility of life in his own flesh at an age when no one should feel vulnerable. Perhaps for that reason, when observing the growth of Rolex, the expansion of its models and the reputation consolidated in different countries, he feels the responsibility of designing a future for the company that does not depend on chance nor on circumstantial heirs. In those years, the usual practice in the business world was to leave control to the family or to sell the company when the founder could no longer lead it. But Wilsdorf had always had a particular relationship with the concept of ownership, perhaps because he had seen his parents' fortune vanish so quickly in his youth. For him, stability could only be achieved when the rules were written clearly, when the future was protected from improvised impulses. It was in 1944, in one of the most delicate moments of his personal life, when he made a decision that would forever change the destiny of his company. That year, his wife, Florence Frances May, passed away, and her loss struck Hans with an intensity that forced him to reorganize his priorities. During much of his adulthood, she had been his emotional support and a key figure in his personal balance. Her absence opened a void difficult to describe. In the face of that pain, the founder of Rolex decided to channel his energy into creating something permanent, something that would guarantee that his company would not be devoured by external interests, nor fragmented, nor used for purposes that contradicted the philosophy he had built. With that idea in mind, he created the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a legal and philanthropic structure that would receive all his shares and that, from then on, would be the owner of Rolex. This decision turned the company into an extraordinarily singular entity within the world of luxury and fine watchmaking, a global, highly profitable enterprise controlled not by traditional shareholders nor by a family, but by a foundation that reinvested part of its profits in educational, cultural, and social causes, and that guaranteed the company would remain private, stable, and aligned with the founder's values. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this move is prodigious. Wilsdorf, instead of choosing the inherited model that dominated the industry, created a structure that shields the company from hostile takeovers, protects its independence, and ensures that the name he had chosen decades earlier, the one born from a combination of letters murmured softly, would remain a symbol of quality without being dragged by short-term financial pressures. The foundation not only protects the economic dimension, it protects the corporate culture, the way of working, the obsession with precision, resistance, and technical excellence. The brand is kept safe from the volatility that, in many companies, ends up diluting identity once the founder is gone. While shaping this legal and philosophical structure, Hans also identified another need, more tactical but equally strategic, expanding the product offering without diluting the essence of Rolex. For years, he had observed an interesting phenomenon in the market. There were clients who deeply admired the quality of Rolex watches but could not afford their price. And there were also distributors requesting highly reliable pieces, but with a more accessible cost. However, producing more economical watches under the same name could damage the carefully built prestige. Rolex needed to remain a benchmark of excellence without concessions, but the market had space for a brand that shared the technical philosophy while holding its own positioning. Thus, 2 years after the creation of the foundation, in 1946, Hans Wilsdorf officially presented to the world a new brand, Tudor. The name, inspired by the English dynasty, sought to evoke historical solidity, sober elegance, and a clear but complementary identity. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity, to offer resistant, precise, and carefully designed watches that shared part of the technical rigor of Rolex, but with a range of prices that made them accessible to a broader public. In modern terms, we would say that Tudor was a sister brand, not internal competition but an intelligent expansion of the universe created by Wilsdorf. To ensure that the new brand was born with credibility, Hans made a strategic decision that confirms his ability to read the market. Tudor would use many of the same quality standards that Rolex applied to its cases and components, while the movements would be supplied by Swiss manufacturers with proven reliability. In this way, Tudor absorbed the practical spirit of Rolex without fully replicating its internal structure, which allowed maintaining differentiated prices without sacrificing consumer trust. For decades, that balance allowed Tudor to consolidate itself as a robust and respected brand, naturally linked to the technical superiority of Rolex, but with its own character. The most interesting thing, however, is observing how these decisions draw an exceptional portrait of Wilsdorf's thinking in his final years of active leadership. His focus was no longer on immediate competition, nor on short-term commercial success, nor even on the personal satisfaction of seeing his name associated with the most recognized watchmaking in the world. He was thinking about permanence, about how to design a system that would withstand generations, about how to create cultural and institutional mechanisms that would allow the company to navigate an unpredictable future while maintaining its essence. That obsession with continuity, expressed both in the creation of the foundation and in the strategic expansion with Tudor, reveals a type of entrepreneur who understands time differently, not as a succession of months or quarters, but as a legacy that must transcend individual lives. As these structures take shape, Rolex strengthens its global position. The independence granted by the foundation allows it to think calmly, invest in innovation without external pressures, and consolidate a brand image based on absolute coherence. Tudor, for its part, begins to develop as a parallel project that expands the group's influence and reaches places where Rolex could not enter without compromising its positioning. It is a sophisticated balance, almost architectural, built with the same precision with which tiny gears are assembled in the workshops. With these firm foundations and the tranquility of knowing that the company was protected for the future, Wilsdorf could observe the next step of watchmaking from a more serene perspective. The world was entering a stage marked by scientific discoveries, technological advances, and an exploratory spirit that would lead humanity to seek the limits of the earth, the sea, and the sky. And in that search, watches would have an unexpected role, accompanying those who dared to cross geographical and human frontiers with an intensity never before seen. Extreme adventures, Everest, oceans, and depth. When the decade of the 1950s arrived, the world adopted a new energy, marked by a desire for recovery, scientific curiosity, and a growing interest in pushing the limits of what was possible. The spirit of exploration crossed mountains, oceans, jungles, deserts, and laboratories, and in that dynamic environment, mechanical watchmaking once again demonstrated that it did not belong solely to showcases lined with velvet, but also to places where human beings confronted nature in its purest form. Rolex, which had spent decades perfecting the resistance and precision of its watches, suddenly found itself at the center of a trend that seemed tailor-made for its philosophy, the era of great expeditions. The brand, so careful with its identity, understood that a watch that claimed to be reliable had to prove it in real scenarios, where climate, pressure, altitude, or depth did not accept excuses. From Geneva, there was close attention paid to how adventurers from around the world sought equipment capable of withstanding extreme conditions, and it was in this context that Rolex began to become increasingly linked to scientific expeditions, climbers, divers, and explorers who agreed to carry its watches in challenges that would expose any mechanical weakness. One of the most emblematic episodes of this stage took place in 1953, when the entire world followed with anticipation the attempts to reach the summit of Mount Everest. That gigantic white colossus, inaccessible for generations, represented the ultimate challenge for any expedition. Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, two names that would pass into history, began the ascent, and among the equipment they carried with them were Rolex watches sent to be tested in extreme conditions. The atrocious cold, the lack of oxygen, the constant vibrations, and the impacts against the rock turned every piece of equipment into a survival test. In that environment, a watch could not fail, because time was an essential resource for calculating climbing rhythms, rest periods, and weather windows. When the climbers reached the summit and returned alive, the achievement became worldwide news, and although the protagonists were, of course, the mountaineers, behind the scenes a detail strengthened the reputation of the brand. The watches sent to accompany them functioned without interruption, resisting freezing temperatures and abrupt pressure changes. Rolex did not turn that episode into an excessive media spectacle. It simply allowed the world to realize on its own that its watches had been present in one of the greatest milestones in the history of exploration. That balance between discretion and forcefulness formed part of the silent but extremely effective strategy that the brand maintained for decades. While Everest confirmed the ability of Rolex watches to face impossible altitudes, a completely different scenario began to capture the attention of scientists and adventurers: the depths of the ocean. Down there, where the pressure increased to levels capable of crushing any poorly designed structure, where light disappeared and silence was almost absolute, time became an even more delicate resource. Every minute underwater involved risk, calculations, and precision, and the need for reliable instruments became critical. In this terrain, Rolex found an ideal field in which to test the advances achieved in hermetic sealing and resistance. During the 1950s and 1960s, the brand became actively involved with professional diving teams, marine scientists, and groups that explored underwater caverns or carried out studies in deep zones. It was in this context that models such as the precursor of the Explorer and the first watches designed for divers became relevant, although the true demonstration of strength would come with a monumental experiment: the expedition of the bathyscaphe Trieste. In 1960, the bathyscaphe, piloted by Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, descended into the Mariana Trench, the deepest known point in the ocean. The pressure exerted at that depth was so brutal that it was almost impossible to imagine, thousands of kilograms per square centimeter, crushing any structure that had not been designed with extreme rigor. On the exterior of the bathyscaphe, exposed to the environment, there traveled an experimental Rolex watch, a reinforced version of the Oyster concept, created especially for that test. The descent was a journey into a dark world in which all sound disappeared and every meter descended increased the danger, but the capsule endured, and with it the watch that hung from its outer hull. When the Trieste reached the bottom, more than 10,000 meters deep, humanity achieved a new historic milestone, and when it returned to the surface, the watch was still functioning. That image of a small mechanical instrument resisting a pressure capable of destroying gigantic structures became such a forceful demonstration that no advertising campaign could have equaled it. The engineering of Rolex was validated in the most hostile environment imaginable, an environment in which any imperfection would have been fatal for the experiment. Beyond mountains and oceans, the brand also appeared in less extreme but equally revealing adventures: explorations on glaciers, missions in tropical zones with constant humidity, polar routes where watches had to withstand months of intense cold. Each real experience served to record data, improve designs, refine gaskets, study materials, strengthen bezels, and optimize movements. For Rolex, these adventures were not marketing campaigns in disguise. They were living laboratories in which theories confronted reality without filters. The importance of this stage lay not only in scientific or sporting feats, but also in the strategic vision behind them. Hans Wilsdorf had always believed that the wristwatch should integrate into people's lives, not as an ornament, but as a tool. The expeditions offered him the perfect context to demonstrate that this vision was not an abstract concept but a philosophy applied coherently. The brand understood that associating with real adventurers was not traditional marketing. It was the most honest way to show its product doing what it had been designed to do: accompany human beings in situations in which time took on an absolute meaning. From an entrepreneurial perspective, this strategy invited reflection on the value of placing a product in the terrain where it had to demonstrate its real utility. Many businesses remain trapped in the promise, in theory, in discourse, but lasting reputation was built when the product lived its reason for being in front of the world's eyes. On frozen summits, in oceanic depths, in scorching deserts, or in turbulent skies, Rolex found the perfect stage to transform each watch into a testament of reliability. With these accumulated experiences and an increasingly solid reputation, the brand began to understand that the modern watch was not only a functional object, but also a professional tool capable of solving specific problems. That idea would open the path toward a stage in which design would no longer be based solely on resistance and precision, but on the ability to create specialized instruments for different types of missions, jobs, and extreme conditions. Professionals of time. When the brand had already demonstrated that its watches could accompany expeditions to Mount Everest, historic dives and adventures in almost any corner of the planet, a very clear idea began to take hold in the minds of those who directed Rolex. The future of watchmaking did not lie solely in creating watches that were resistant and precise in general terms, but in creating instruments conceived for specific kinds of work, for professions in which time is used as a tool for calculation, for safety, or for decision-making. The wristwatch left behind its stage as a simple, elegant companion and entered fully into the category of professional equipment on the same level as an altimeter, a compass, or diving gear. One of the first fields in which that vision found fertile ground was the underwater world. After the war, diving became much more accessible, both in military and scientific contexts and in recreational ones. The popularization of autonomous diving equipment, underwater cameras, and marine expeditions led by pioneers such as Jacques Cousteau generated a new figure, the modern diver, who needed to control immersion time so as not to put his life at risk. Calculating the minutes spent underwater was just as important as the amount of air in the tank, and there a concrete need appeared that a well-designed watch could cover with precision. It is in that setting that the Submariner is born, presented at the beginning of the decade of the 1950s as a watch created for real divers, not as an aesthetic whim with a couple of marine details. Its watertight case, derived from the Oyster concept, was designed to withstand considerable depths for the time. The rotating bezel allowed the diver to mark the start of the immersion and control at a glance to the elapsed time. The hands and indices with luminescent material guaranteed visibility in the dimness of the seabed. The combination of these characteristics turned the watch into a trustworthy companion for those who descended into zones where a moment of distraction could have definitive consequences. As the years passed, the Submariner continued evolving, gaining improvements in water resistance, protections around the crown, more robust bracelets, and design details that refined its personality without betraying its functional essence. Many professional divers, including members of navies and specialized teams, adopted this model as part of their equipment, and in parallel it began to attract the attention of people who would never wear a neoprene suit, but who felt drawn to the idea of carrying on their wrist a watch capable of diving into oceans while they crossed the city on their way to the office. It is a constant in the history of Rolex. The watches are born to solve concrete problems and end up becoming symbols of a way of life, even for those who do not live that reality in the first person. While the underwater world was generating a new category of immersion, watches, the sky was experiencing its own revolution. The appearance of large commercial jet aircraft, transcontinental routes, and the rise of airlines that connected cities once far apart made the concept of time zone shift from being a geographical detail to becoming an everyday experience for pilots and crews. Sleeping in one country, waking up in another, taking off with the hour of origin, and landing with the hour of destination, coordinating communications with control towers in different meridians. All of this demanded a clear and practical way of visualizing at least 2 times simultaneously. This is where the GMT Master enters the scene, developed in collaboration with Pan American World Airways to help its pilots manage the new reality of the jet age. The watch incorporated a 4th hand, which completed a full turn of the dial in 24 hours and pointed to an additional scale, while a 2-tone rotating bezel allowed quick reading of the reference time and the local time. For a long-distance pilot, being able to check at a glance the time at home and the time of the destination was not a whim, it was an operational necessity. For an executive who traveled constantly, wearing that same watch on the wrist was almost a declaration of belonging to a new global elite that lived among airports, meetings, and hotels. On solid ground, time also began to acquire a special role in the political and business world. There were leaders who needed to manage extremely dense agendas, coordinate meetings, sign documents, and appear at official events with precision. In that context, Rolex introduced in the year 1956 a watch that aimed to become a symbol of leadership, the day-date. This model displayed on the dial not only the date, visible in a window at the height of 3 o'clock, but also the day of the week written out in full in an opening at the top. The message was clear. Whoever wears this watch has control over the calendar, knows exactly in which point of the month and the week they are, and by extension, communicates an image of control over their own time. The day-date was offered in precious metals, not in steel, which reinforced its association with figures of power. Over the years, it would end up receiving the nickname of the Watch of Presidents, because several political figures and heads of state wore it on their wrists in public events and in photographs that circled the world. Beyond the shine of gold or platinum, what is interesting from a business perspective is seeing how Rolex understood that it could create a watch intended for those who make decisions, integrating the information of the day and the date in an elegant and proportioned design, and turning it into a piece that spoke of authority without the need for words. The sports world also demanded its own time instrument. In racing circuits, chronographs were essential tools for measuring laps, calculating average speeds, and comparing performance. Rolex had long been manufacturing watches with chronograph functions, but it was in the decade of the 1960s that this facet took a particularly iconic form, with the arrival of a model associated with speed and the roar of engines, the Cosmograph Daytona. Named in honor of the Daytona circuit in Florida, one of the most emblematic places in North American motor racing, this watch presented subdials to measure short intervals, a tachymetric scale on the bezel to calculate speeds, and a powerful aesthetic that fit perfectly with the environment of pit lanes, gasoline, and burning tires. Although in its early years it was not an immediate commercial success, over time it would become one of the most desired watches by collectors around the planet, driven by its history, its design, and its relationship with figures from the world of cinema and motorsports, a facet that will appear with greater force later in our narration. If one looks at this entire period as a whole, one realizes that Rolex was playing a very well-planned game. It did not limit itself to producing beautiful watches. It developed instruments that responded to the specific needs of divers, pilots, political leaders, and high-performance athletes. Each important model from that era is born from a very concrete question. What problem does this professional have with time? How can I help him solve it with an object he carries on his wrist, and that will function faithfully under the worst conditions? From that question, technical solutions are built that, with time, move beyond the circle of professional users and reach the general public, who adopt them as symbols of style and aspiration. For someone interested in entrepreneurship, this approach contains a clear lesson. When you create products by thinking first of those who truly need to use them under pressure, the results tend to be so solid that they end up attracting many others, including those who only seek the thrill of belonging to that world. The submariner seduces someone who has never worn fins. The GMT master fascinates someone who barely flies during holidays. The day-date completes the image of those who aspire to see themselves as important decision-makers, and the Daytona connects with anyone who feels they have something of a pilot inside, even if they drive a normal car. In parallel with this consolidation of professional watches, popular culture began to pay more and more attention to the objects worn by actors, athletes, and public figures, and certain models started appearing on magazine covers, in films, and in photographs that circulated throughout the planet, transforming some of these watches, born as tools, into true status symbols and cult pieces whose emotional and economic value would grow in ways difficult to imagine in those years. Hollywood, Daytona, and the symbol of status. To understand the next stage in the history of Rolex, it is necessary to slightly change the mental setting. We come from the mountains, from the depths of the sea, and from the open skies, from seeing watches perform almost heroic functions as working tools, and suddenly the story moves to red carpets, photo sessions, magazine covers, and racing circuits where the roar of engines mixes with the noise of cameras. The professional watch, designed for divers, pilots, or racers, begins to appear in a place that, at first glance, seems unrelated to extreme effort, although in reality it shares with it an essential characteristic. It is a stage where everyone is watching. From the middle of the 20th century, Hollywood became a global machine for creating images and idols. Any object that appeared frequently on the wrist of a known actor, on a movie poster, or in an iconic photograph, ended up acquiring a symbolic value that went far beyond its original function. In that context, Rolex did not have to force an entry. It arrived there because its watches were already appreciated by people who valued precision, the feeling of solidity, and a sober aesthetic. Actors, directors, musicians, and public figures, fascinated by the combination of history, reliability, and presence that these pieces conveyed, began to incorporate them into their daily lives, and from there they passed onto the screen without major planned campaigns, almost as a natural consequence of their personal decisions. Among all the models, one that had been born timidly as a tool for racing drivers ended up finding in this universe an unexpected path toward myth. The Cosmograph Daytona. When it was launched in the decade of the 1960s, it was not an immediate success. The market for sports chronographs was competitive. The taste of the era was in transition and, for a time, many Daytona models rested quietly in display cases without generating the madness that today we associate with their name. It was a technically impeccable watch, robust, with a balanced design and a clear automotive vocation, but it was still missing something that would connect it with the collective imagination on a large scale. That something would end up arriving through a specific person with a face, biography, and charisma of his own. That person was Paul Newman. Actor, amateur, driver, and a figure admired, both for his talent and for his lifestyle. Newman received from his wife a Daytona with a particular dial, very striking in design for the time, which collectors would eventually call exotic. He began to wear it naturally in his daily life and, above all, in the paddock of the races in which he competed. Photographs began to accumulate. Newman in racing overalls, Newman adjusting his helmet, Newman checking lap times with the chronograph on his wrist. Without major advertisements or planned campaigns, that union between an admired man and his watch built, photograph by photograph, an emotional bond in the mind of the public. For years, that Daytona was just another object in Newman's biography, a faithful companion, marked, scratched, and truly worn. Only decades later, when interest in vintage watches began to intensify, that specific combination of model, dial, and person transformed into the epicenter of a collecting fever that led to auctions with figures that seemed unreal to anyone observing the matter from the outside. The day Paul Newman's Daytona was sold for a multi-million sum, the world clearly saw something that enthusiasts already knew. The price was not being paid only for steel, crystal, and gears. It was being paid for a story condensed into a small object. Rolex, which had always bet on associating its watches with people who had intense stories, saw the strength of that strategy confirmed, perhaps in a more spectacular way than it had ever imagined. In parallel with this almost organic construction of symbols, the brand developed a network of strategic sponsorships in worlds where time plays a starring role. Endurance motorsport, high-level tennis, major golf tournaments, ocean sailing, competitions where synchronization, timing, and measurements are an essential part of the spectacle. In many of these events, the clocks on the timing panels, on the trophies, or on the wrists of the winners bore the same crown on the dial. The message engraved in the collective unconscious was simple and powerful. When time truly matters, this is the watch you have nearby. The strength of that presence did not depend on loud advertisements, but on the silent repetition of the same idea in different contexts. A spectator saw a racing podium crowned by a logo, then a tennis player lifting a trophy with a recognizable watch on his wrist, then an international regatta sponsored by the same brand. Without needing to explain it in words, a mental association was built between performance, achievement, and that name that Hans Wilsdorf had once written on a piece of paper as an ideal combination of letters for a dial. As the years passed, that association also filtered into business culture, into boardrooms, into gala dinners, into circles where success is measured in contracts, mergers, and high-impact decisions. The Rolex watch began to be seen, in many contexts, as a kind of informal certificate of personal achievement. For some, it symbolized the first major milestone achieved in their career. For others, a gift marking an important moment, a company sold, a promotion, a project successfully completed. In that sense, the brand achieved something that few companies have accomplished so clearly, turning its product into a kind of private trophy, a daily reminder on the wrist that effort, sleepless nights, and the risks taken had led to a meaningful point on the path. That symbolic dimension, however, brought a challenge. Managing the transition from professional tool to status symbol without a port and 40 point, losing technical credibility. Rolex could not afford to become a simple, expensive ornament. Its reputation had been built on the ability to function in extreme conditions. The brand strove to maintain that dual condition by obsessively caring for quality, precision certification, and the robustness of its cases and bracelets, even when a significant part of those who bought its watches would not expose them to dangers greater than a bump against an office desk. The promise that the watch would continue to function on the summit of Mount Everest or at the bottom of the ocean, even if you never take it there, was an essential part of the emotional magnetism surrounding it. From the perspective of business strategy, the move is brilliant. By designing watches for those who truly need extreme performance, the brand creates a product whose excess capability becomes a selling point for those who seek only the symbolic part. It is the same logic that leads someone to buy a sports car they will never push to its limit, or mountaineering equipment that will never face a real storm, knowing that the tool could handle all that, even if you do not, feeds the feeling of power, possibility, and belonging to a world larger than your routine. While Hollywood, sports, and the corporate world consolidated Rolex as an emblem of success, the technological and cultural landscape of watchmaking began to shift beneath the surface. In laboratories of other countries and in factories that did not have the historical prestige of Swiss watchmaking, engineers and entrepreneurs were working on a new way of measuring time, based on quartz crystals and electronic circuits, a technology capable of offering superior precision at a much lower cost. This innovation, which at first seemed a curiosity, was about to shake the foundations of the entire industry and force the brand of the crown to make decisions that would define its identity during the second half of the 20th century. The quartz crisis. At the end of the decade of the 1960s, while Rolex was consolidating its image as a professional watch and a symbol of status, in distant laboratories a silent revolution was being formed, one that many in Switzerland underestimated for far too long. In the year 1969, the first commercially sold quartz wristwatch appeared in Japan, and with it a new era in timekeeping began. Electronic movements, quartz crystals oscillating at extremely high frequencies, extraordinary precision, production costs falling rapidly, and a promise that sounded irresistible to millions of consumers: to have a very inexpensive watch that lost or gained only a few seconds per month. What for many traditional watchmakers was a technological oddity, for the Japanese industry was the beginning of a strategy intended to completely reconfigure the global market. Swiss watchmaking, accustomed to being the guiding light of the sector, reacted at first with a certain arrogance. For generations, precision had been an almost exclusive heritage of the Helvetic workshops, built through metals, gears, and artisanal hands. In comparison, those quartz watches seemed like electronic toys, cold objects without mechanical soul, destined for massive popular consumption. However, the general public had different priorities. For many people, the important thing was not the type of energy that moved the hands, nor the nobility of the internal finishes, but the ease of use, resistance to everyday impacts, exactness, and above all, price. The Japanese brands knew how to read that demand with brutal clarity. In practice, the change was devastating for hundreds of Swiss companies. In just a few years, shop windows filled with colorful, lightweight, extremely precise quartz watches that were within the reach of almost any pocket. Suddenly, the promise of a reliable and exact mechanical watch stopped impressing anyone who could buy, for much less money, a digital watch that displayed hours, minutes, seconds, alarm, and stopwatch without the need for winding or sophisticated maintenance. Many historic houses that had built mechanical calibers for decades or even centuries saw their orders collapse, their workshops empty, and their names disappear into hasty mergers or liquidations. The so-called quartz crisis was, in truth, an earthquake that changed the entire landscape of watchmaking. In the middle of that turbulent scene, Rolex had to decide what to do with its own identity. The pressure was enormous. Quartz watches promised a precision that no mechanical movement could consistently match, and they cost a fraction of the price. The danger was not only losing sales, it was losing cultural relevance, being labeled as a relic of the past. The temptation to transform completely and abandon mechanics to embrace electronics floated over many offices. In some cases, that temptation became a decision and ended in disaster. Rolex, however, chose a far more nuanced path. On the one hand, it did not ignore the new technology. It participated, along with other companies, in the development of Swiss quartz movements and eventually presented its own quartz models, some with very distinctive designs, such as the Oyster quartz line. Through these watches, it demonstrated that it was perfectly capable of mastering electronics, creating angular cases, adapting to new aesthetic trends, and offering extreme precision. It was a way of telling the world, if we wanted to be a quartz brand, we could do it and do it well. But at the same time, the company made a fundamental decision that would be crucial for its future: to preserve the mechanical heart as the essence of the brand. Instead of understanding the crisis as a direct competition in terms of price and precision figures, Rolex began to rethink its value proposition. A high-end mechanical watch could not win the battle of pure accuracy against a simple quartz model, but it could win in other areas: durability, prestige, craftsmanship, the feeling when worn, the history behind each model, consistency in design, and the ability to pass through generations as an heirloom object. The company took the difficulty of the moment as an opportunity to redefine its position in the market. It was no longer about producing the watch that everyone could have, but the watch that represented something deeper in the life of its owner. In this process, the notion of luxury took an interesting turn. Before, in many cases, luxury was associated solely with noble materials and technical complications. After the quartz crisis, Rolex helped solidify a concept of luxury based on the combination of real utility and symbolic value. A submariner, a GMT master, or a day-date ceased to be simply refined working instruments. They became emblems of a way of understanding time, of preferring mechanical complexity over the absolute ease of electronics, of valuing human technical work in a world filling with chips and disposable components. While many companies attempted to survive by shifting toward increasingly cheaper ranges or by completely abandoning mechanics, Rolex strengthened prices, invested in improving finishes, revised internal standards to make quality controls even stricter, and communicated subtly but consistently one idea: a watch from this house is not a gadget that you replace when the next model appears. It is an object designed to last for decades and to remain relevant even when fashion fades. Instead of lowering the product to adapt to the new tide of quartz, it elevated even more the perception of its mechanical watches. During those years of transformation, the company also strengthened another facet that would be crucial for the chapters that followed: control of production. The news of brands disappearing, suppliers closing, and workshops shutting down served as a warning. Depending too much on third parties could be dangerous in a technological environment that changed so quickly. Every time a component manufacturer disappeared or was absorbed, someone lost an essential piece of their value chain. Rolex, which had always been demanding with its partners, began deepening the idea of integrating more and more processes within its own structure, buying suppliers, investing in machinery, and forming internal teams capable of handling an increasingly larger portion of production. For those who build businesses today in sectors undergoing profound technological changes, the attitude of Rolex towards the quartz crisis offers a very clear lesson. There are moments in which following the majority trend leads directly to the cliff, and the solution lies in clinging even more strongly to what makes you unique, even if that path is harder in the short term. Instead of trying to become just another quartz manufacturer, the Swiss brand decided to emphasize its difference. It explained, through actions and products, that the value of a mechanical watch could not be compared solely in terms of precision per currency unit, that there existed an emotional, cultural, and material dimension that placed it in another category. By the end of the decade of the 1980s, the landscape of watchmaking had been radically transformed. Many historic firms disappeared, others were reborn under new groups, and some found salvation in creative proposals that combined design and quartz. Rolex emerged from that turbulent period strengthened, with a clearer identity, robust mechanical watches of high quality, with a solid image in the collective imagination, and a constantly growing aura of exclusivity. But this new stage brought with it other challenges. As the global demand for Rolex watches increased, the company faced the need to control its production chain, its distributors, and the information the world had about it with greater rigor. Surviving the quartz crisis had shown that thinking in the long term was vital. Now it was time to build an almost shielded structure that protected the brand from market distortions, counterfeits, excessive exposure, and hasty decisions. And to achieve this, the company would enter a phase of deep integration, calculated secrecy, and meticulous management of scarcity that would eventually define its modern personality. Total integration and the art of scarcity. After surviving the quartz crisis and strengthening an even more solid identity around the highly reliable mechanical watch, Rolex enters a decisive stage in the shaping of its modern personality. The era of absolute integration, of almost surgical control of each process, of a way of operating that combines industrial precision, strategic secrecy, and a very deep understanding of the value that arises when a product is perceived as desired, scarce, and, at the same time, unbreakable. In this period, the company stops resembling a traditional Swiss manufacturer and begins to operate like an institution with its own rules, almost like a state within the watchmaking industry. The question that guided the thinking of those who directed the brand in those years was quite simple to formulate, although difficult to execute: how to guarantee that a mechanical watch, produced in relatively high volumes for luxury standards, maintains an aura of exclusivity and at the same time preserves a practically unchanging quality. The answer, after observing the mistakes made by competitors and the changes in the global market, became clear. By controlling every step of the production and distribution chain, leaving no room for improvisation or for external dependencies that could become weaknesses. Until that point, Rolex relied on specialized Swiss suppliers to manufacture certain essential components: dials, bracelets, cases, movement elements. This model had worked for generations because the Swiss industry was composed of a very solid network of small family companies with impressive artisanal skill. But the quartz crisis had demonstrated that this network could fracture. Many suppliers disappeared, Others were absorbed by rival groups, and some did not manage to adapt to technological changes. Each loss, each closure, each bankruptcy was a reminder that depending too much on third parties could put at risk not only production, but the entire identity of a brand that did not allow the slightest inconsistency. From that diagnosis, Rolex launched itself into a strategy of vertical integration without precedent in modern watchmaking. It purchased historic workshops, absorbed key suppliers, invested in buildings, machinery, and its own laboratories, and created a closed ecosystem in which every screw, every hand, every link and every movement was produced under direct supervision. For many, this process went unnoticed because it was carried out discreetly, without major announcements, without fanfare. But in reality, it was transforming the company from within. When the consolidation was complete, Rolex depended practically on no one to manufacture its watches, something extremely rare in a sector where outsourcing had long been the norm. Absolute control did not stop at the manufacturing side. The brand also reviewed and perfected the way its watches circulated around the world. Historically, distributors had enjoyed a certain autonomy to decide which pieces to receive, how to sell them, and what margins to apply. Rolex understood that this model could generate dangerous distortions, especially when demand exceeded supply. So it implemented a system of carefully selected dealers, subjected to strict rules of presentation, service, and communication. The brand began to closely monitor waiting lists, model allocation, pricing, and the relationship with the customer. This level of control inevitably generated a phenomenon that the brand learned to manage with mastery: scarcity. In many markets, obtaining a specific Rolex became a challenge, something that required patience, contacts, or simply good luck, and that difficulty transformed itself into a psychological magnet. The buyer stopped feeling that they were paying only for a watch. They paid to enter a restricted circle, to possess an object that was not immediately within everyone's reach, to participate in a global community that recognized and valued that limited access. The company did not need to say it explicitly. The dynamic established itself naturally. When supply is controlled and demand is high, desire multiplies. However, it would be a mistake to think of scarcity as a superficial strategy. Rolex has never presented the lack of stock as a commercial trick. In fact, it avoids speaking about numbers, avoids revealing production figures, avoids commenting on waiting lists. That discretion is part of the charm. The company does not feed scarcity with speeches, but with a production that prioritizes quality over volume, that adds extraordinarily strict internal controls, where each watch must pass tests of water resistance, precision, endurance, and durability that other brands could not assume without massive delays. This approach makes scarcity a natural consequence of the process, not an artificial maneuver. Vertical integration brings with it another powerful effect: the ability to innovate without asking permission from anyone. The internal teams of Rolex do not depend on external suppliers to develop new alloys, new lubricants, new inspection machines, or new materials for critical components. Projects such as the Parachrome emerge, a balanced spring resistant to magnetic fields and thermal variations, followed later by even more advanced versions. Chemical laboratories are built, research centers for metals, robotized facilities for repetitive tests. While other brands turn to specialized manufacturers for certain advances, Rolex can develop them internally, test them, discard them, or implement them without losing control or speed. Anyone observing this process from the world of entrepreneurship can detect a profound philosophy. The company understands that dependence is a vulnerability, that delegating too many crucial phases can jeopardize decades of reputation, and it also understands that technical excellence can only be sustained if the company is willing to invest enormous amounts of 2002 in Sonnen, resources in processes that the final customer will never see directly, but that make a difference in terms of reliability and consistency. In this stage, another key element of the modern identity of Rolex emerges: secrecy. The company speaks little, grants few interviews, publishes little data, does not appear at fairs for many years, and maintains a sober institutional profile. For some critics, that attitude is hermetic to the point of exaggeration, but from a strategic perspective, it makes sense. By reducing to a minimum the amount of information that circulates, the brand protects itself from rumors, from ephemeral trends, and from external pressures. Additionally, that silence generates an atmosphere of mystery that fuels public interest. The absence of detailed explanations forces each person to imagine their own version of what occurs behind the walls of the buildings of Geneva and Biel. The company achieves something that few luxury brands succeed in, installing in the collective mind the idea that the product is so good, so studied, and so coherent that it does not need to justify itself. Silence becomes part of the identity. Words are replaced by the user experience, by the feeling of weight of the watch, by the texture of the bracelet, by the precise click of the bezel, by the way the seconds hand advances with a continuous movement. During this period of silent consolidation, Rolex also perfects its ability to control the cultural narrative without needing to intervene directly. The people who wear its watches, entrepreneurs, athletes, artists, modern explorers, become unofficial spokespersons. Each public appearance, each photograph, each personal story adds to the global reputation. The brand, from its calculated discretion, allows the product to speak through those who use it. When this structure of integration, secrecy, quality control, and natural management of scarcity finishes settling, Rolex finds itself with an almost indestructible foundation from which it can face any future change. The global market expands, digital culture transforms communication, collecting acquires a new dimension, and watchmaking fills with extravagant proposals. But the brand of the crown remains firm, advancing at its own rhythm, without falling into the noise or the temptation of producing more than its philosophy allows. And after having reinforced its production and consolidated an almost impenetrable structure, the company enters a period in which the value of its watches begins to behave in an unexpected way, becoming an object of investment, speculation, extreme desire, and a global phenomenon that completely transcends the classical universe of watchmaking. A stage where the secondary market, auctions, and social networks begin to play an unexpected role. Records at auctions and vintage fever. When the internal structure of Rolex was already functioning like a perfectly adjusted machine, with production under control, quality monitored down to the smallest detail, and scarcity turned into a natural consequence of the process, a curious phenomenon began to occur, almost unrelated to the offices in Geneva, but deeply connected to the work accumulated over decades. The secondary market ignited like a bonfire. The watches that had once been work tools, celebration gifts, or carefully considered indulgences began to reappear at international auctions, in the hands of collectors, dealers, and specialized houses that saw in them something more than instruments for measuring time. Those pieces began to be treated as portable art, as fragments of history condensed in steel, gold, and aged tritium. For many years, buying a Rolex had been an important decision but relatively simple to understand. You paid for a well-made, resistant watch with prestige that would accompany you for decades. Little by little, that equation began to change. Certain old references, produced in limited quantities or with peculiar characteristics, became objects of obsession for collectors willing to travel, research, negotiate, and, when the moment arrived, bid with determination. Submariner models with slightly different dials, GMT masterpieces with rare colors, day-date watches with unusual combinations, and, above all, some Daytona chronographs from past eras, especially those linked to very specific personal stories. Auctions became the stage for a new form of narrative. The conversation was no longer only about calibers, cases, and references. It was about provenance, about old photographs where the watch could be seen on the wrist of its original owner, about letters, certificates, and anecdotes that gave each piece an unrepeatable personality. Experts began to trace genealogies of watches as if they were family trees, following the trail from one owner to another until the moment when the piece was presented before the auctioneer's hammer. Each time the gavel fell and a record amount was announced, the world of watchmaking looked up. One of the moments that symbolized this fever was the auction of the Daytona belonging to Paul Newman, that watch that had accompanied the actor for years. Worn on racetracks and photographed time and time again without pretension. When it went to auction and reached an astronomical price, many spectators who were not familiar with the world of collecting were left bewildered. It seemed absurd to pay such an amount for a watch that, in essence, was still steel, crystal, and a mechanical caliber. However, for those who understood what lay behind it, the value did not reside solely in the object, but in the story, in the symbolic energy accumulated, in the idea that the piece represented a unique fragment of contemporary culture. The effect of these records was multiplicative. Each news story about a vintage Rolex reaching spectacular figures fed the curiosity of new collectors, awakened the interest of investors who had never looked at watchmaking, and fueled the imagination of enthusiasts who began to search the drawers of their parents or grandparents in search of that forgotten old watch. At the same time, social networks entered the scene with unprecedented force. Detailed photographs of cracked dials, faded bezels, and cases marked by use went viral among enthusiast communities that valued precisely those signs of life as proof of authenticity and character. What for Rolex had been, for decades, a natural consequence of the passage of time, a watch aging alongside its owner, transformed into a new category of desire, patina. Natural wear, which in other products would be considered a defect, became a source of fascination. A cream tone on the indices, a slight variation in the color of an insert, a particular typography in a short series. All of that could elevate the price of a piece to levels that would have been unthinkable at the time of its manufacture. The idea of the Grail watch took hold, the dreamed, almost mythical watch that every collector had in mind and that often would never be possessed. From the brand's perspective, this phenomenon had a double edge. On one hand, it reinforced its aura of permanence. Seeing watches from decades past achieving increasing values at auctions sent a very powerful message. A Rolex does not exhaust itself at the moment of purchase. It is not consumed like an ordinary product, but can, with the passage of years, become heritage, an object to be passed down through generations. On the other hand, the company did not directly control that secondary market, which operated under its own rules, driven by the interaction between limited supply, specialized information, and collective emotion. It was like watching a gigantic tree grow from the seed you planted, but which now extended its branches beyond your garden. For the attentive entrepreneur, there is a fascinating lesson here. The true solidity of a brand is revealed when the market spontaneously creates an ecosystem around it. Forums, video channels, profiles devoted to analyzing minute details of a specific model, auction houses competing for the next great piece, dealers trying to balance the relationship between regular clients and a demand seeking watches both for use and for investment. None of that appears if the product does not have real quality and a narrative accumulated over years. You can force hype for a while, but sustained fever only arises when the object withstands the most demanding scrutiny. Over time, the amounts paid at auctions began to influence the perception of new watches as well. Many people began to view the purchase of a current model not only as an expense but as a kind of store of value. Taken to the extreme, this approach propelled the expansion of a parallel market in which newly acquired pieces, especially the most desired ones, passed from the official boutique to the hands of resellers who offered them at an immediate premium to impatient buyers. Waiting lists grew longer, rumors about availability spread quickly, and the brand found itself in the middle of a complex dynamic where legitimate desire mixed with speculation. Rolex responded to this reality with the same calm that had characterized its trajectory. Without haste, without feeding scandal, strengthening its relationship with distributors, closing ranks against practices it considered contrary to its philosophy, and maintaining, in essence, control over its production. The company does not communicate manufacturing figures nor plans for massive increases, which sends a clear message to the market. The priority continues to be quality and coherence, even if that means that some watches remain difficult to obtain. That attitude may frustrate those who want immediate gratification, but it strengthens the mystique for those who understand that part of the charm of certain objects resides precisely in the waiting. Meanwhile, the vintage ecosystem continues to expand. Each year, specialized books appear, catalogs devoted to specific references, articles documenting the evolution of a model with rigor reminiscent of academic work. Major auction houses proudly announce when several exceptional Rolex pieces coincide in the same event, aware that each of them attracts an audience willing to move figures that, decades ago, were reserved for traditional works of art. All this movement, seen in perspective, demonstrates that the brand's history is not a straight line of manufacturing and selling, but a complex tapestry in which clients, collectors, merchants, experts, and curious individuals all participate. Each contributes something: an anecdote, an old photograph, a forgotten catalog, a piece in original condition that suddenly sheds light on an unknown variant. Rolex, from its calculated silence, observes how that universe grows around it and, although it does not direct it directly, benefits from the energy it generates, because each auction record, each article about a rare model, each story of an inherited watch reinforces the idea that the brand is interwoven with the passage of time in a way that goes beyond the simple measurement of hours and minutes. And while prices in the secondary market continue making headlines and waiting lists fuel conversations around the world, the company continues operating from its foundation in Geneva, facing contemporary challenges that no longer have to do solely with technology or production, but with sustainability, transparency, philanthropy, and the role that a private, immense, and almost hermetic company must play in a world that demands more and more explanations from those who hold positions of such weight in the economy and in the collective imagination. The present empire and its lessons. If we look at the present of Rolex as if it were the dial of one of its watches, what appears is not a luxury brand isolated in a display case, but a complex organism that breathes at the rhythm of a hyper-connected world full of contradictions, expectations, and tensions. The company is still owned by the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a detail that many people overlook, but which influences almost everything. It is not listed on the stock exchange. It has no shareholders pushing for quarterly results. It does not live obsessed with convincing financial analysts, and that freedom allows it to make decisions with a decades-long perspective, something increasingly rare in today's business ecosystem. That peculiar structure translates into a different way of understanding growth. Rolex earns enormous amounts of money, but it is not designed to inflate figures endlessly. Instead, it seeks to maintain a kind of equilibrium between demand, production, and positioning. The company invests in factories, in technology, in employee training, in cultural and sports sponsorships, and also in philanthropic activities that are channeled through the foundation. Although the brand speaks very little about that side and deliberately keeps it in the background, this silence generates curiosity and criticism at the same time. There are those who appreciate discretion, and there are those who believe that an organization of that size should show more openly how it gives part of its success back to society. In parallel, the world of luxury watchmaking has been pushed to reflect on issues that a few decades ago did not even appear in strategic plans: environmental impact, origin of materials, working conditions throughout the supply chain, and informational transparency. The extraction of metals, the production of steel, the labor in workshops and suppliers, everything is scrutinized in a context where young consumers question almost every purchase decision. Rolex has had to adapt processes, certifications, and internal policies to align its industrial empire with the expectations of a world more aware of the real cost of producing durable objects. It is not a radical transformation from one day to the next, but a constant adjustment seeking to preserve coherence with that idea of a watch that can pass through generations without becoming a disposable item. Meanwhile, the market has become louder and faster. The rise of the internet, social media, and buying and selling platforms has multiplied the brand's visibility to levels that would have been difficult to imagine in the times of Hans Wilsdorf. Today, any Rolex release is analyzed minute by minute, commented on in forums, dissected in videos, and compared with historical models in endless threads. Photographs of wrists appear from all over the world, from executives in skyscrapers to enthusiasts who have saved for years for their first piece, and that constant exposure fuels a brand's desire that, in many cases, moves faster than production. In this environment, the so-called gray market and massive counterfeiting have become forces the brand must confront daily. There are new watches being resold almost at the very moment they leave the store, and there are copies of unsettling quality circulating online, testing the knowledge of buyers and the skill of retailers. Rolex responds by strengthening its relationship with official dealers, tightening selection criteria, introducing technical details that make imitation even more difficult, and maintaining its policy of not selling through its own digital channels, which is almost countercultural in an era when everything seems to be sold online. That decision reinforces the idea that buying a Rolex is something that happens face-to-face, with a certain ritual, in a physical space where the customer can be given an experience that goes beyond simply clicking a button. That loyalty to its own codes, even when the environment pushes in the opposite direction, largely defines the character of the contemporary Rolex empire. While emerging brands launch into frantic collaborations, radical design changes, and flamboyant campaigns to capture immediate attention, the House of the Crown follows its own rhythm. It evolves iconic designs through subtle changes, adjusts millimeters of proportions, improves calibers, and introduces new colors or materials gradually, as if wanting to remind the world that the brand's time is measured in decades, not in seasons. For some, this approach is conservative. For others, it is precisely what provides reassurance, what makes the brand a kind of anchor in the middle of a market that constantly comes and goes. For those interested in entrepreneurship, perhaps the most valuable aspect of this current phase is not the brightness of the results, but the coherence of the journey. Rolex demonstrates that a gigantic company can be built without losing clarity of purpose, that one can say a lot while speaking very little, and that products, customer stories, and the passage of time can define the narrative. The company also shows that controlling the value chain, no matter how costly it may seem at first, can become your best insurance when the environment becomes uncertain, whether due to technological changes, economic crises, or profound cultural transformations. Another important lesson is the way it manages expectations. In a world where many brands promise to reinvent the wheel every 2 years, Rolex has chosen the opposite path, to limit itself to perfecting it without unnecessary fireworks. This approach sometimes confuses those who expect grand spectacle at each fair or presentation, but it strengthens the trust of those who value stability. We could say that the company has understood something very human. Intense desire can be awakened through novelty, but lasting trust is built through consistency. When looking back and reviewing the journey from that German orphan boy who lost his parents to the present-day organization that moves billions and accumulates waiting lists on all continents, it becomes clear that the guiding thread has not been luck, nor a single stroke of genius, but a precise combination of obsession with quality, strategic reading of the context, and courageous decisions made during moments of uncertainty. Hans Wilsdorf could not foresee all the challenges that would come after his death, but he did prepare the company to face them with a solid structure, a foundation as owner, and a culture that prioritizes the long term. And while you listen to this story, perhaps with your eyelids already heavy, there are thousands of watches bearing the crown marking the time across the planet. In boardrooms, in mechanical workshops, in airplane cabins, in restaurants, on boats, on anonymous hands, and on famous wrists. Each one beats at its own rhythm, but all share the same underlying idea. Someone, at some point, decided that time deserved to be measured with respect, with rigor, and with beauty. Understanding how an empire like this is built does not guarantee success in your own project, although it leaves you with a rather inspiring certainty. When you choose clear principles, work with patience, and accept that time is an ally rather than an enemy, the likelihood of creating something that outlives you increases silently, almost like the smooth movement of a hand across the dial in the middle of the night. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of Rolex. It has been a pleasure to share it with you tonight. If you enjoyed it, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments and know which other brand you would like us to explore together. And if you have not done so yet, subscribe so that you do not miss the upcoming documentaries. Rest well and have a peaceful night. Good night.